Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Welcome to our educational program, accessible to all foreign correspondents here in the US. It's actually organized by the Foreign Press Correspondent Association in the United States and developed in partnership with General Motors to learn about the aftermath of the 2022 United Nations Climate Change Conference, how the electric vehicle revolution can contribute to fighting the climate change. So we have today three very special guests, Shilpan Amin, Lina Hansen, and Andy Auri, to join our conversation and to let us know all about this very important topic. So good morning, the three of you. We can get to know you a bit better shortly. Before introducing them properly, let me briefly explain you what brought us here today and what are we talking about in the next coming hour. In the past few years, the automotive industry has been going through the greatest transformation of its history. Electric and autonomous vehicles, new software, battery technologies, and innovative design promise to revolutionize the way we move people and goods from one point to another. A more sustainable world is both the drive and the outcome of this transformation, and doing the transition in an equitable manner is crucial for a better future for everyone. So in this educational program, foreign correspondents will have the opportunity to learn how the industry is tackling key issues of the transition towards a zero emissions future as the topic takes center stage in global forums like, for example, recently COP27, where the private and public sectors come together to discuss challenges, set ambition targets, and forge partnerships to accelerate that transition. So now it's time to say goodbye, good morning, and welcome to this conversation to our three special guests, as I mentioned before. Let's start with Shilpan Amin. He is the General Motors Senior Vice President and President of GM International. He leads General Motors International, GM's most culturally diverse team with operations in over 60 global markets. He has been with GM for 27 years and held leadership roles within GM's vehicle engineering and global purchasing and supply chain organization before joining GMI. He also serves in a number of boards, such as GM's Inclusion Advisory Board and the Asian Pacific American Chamber of Commerce. Before we can see them and keep this conversation open, let's also introduce our next guest. She's Lina Hansen, the Managing Director and Chief Strategy Officer, Rocky Mountain Institute. She focuses on understanding the overall energy transition and stage of global climate change action and connecting RMI's portfolio of work to that. She has more than 20 years of experience developing, testing, and implementing innovative market-based clean energy solutions. And she also led RMI's US electricity program, where she focused on electric utility business models and the integration of renewable and distributed energy resources into the grid. And third, we do have with us also Andy Auri. He's an engineering technical leader of battery packs General Motors. Is the engineering technical leader for high voltage battery packs at General Motors, as I just said. He has also 23 years of experience in automotive product development, focused on chassis and battery engineering. He earned a bachelor's degree from MIT in technical engineering and a master's from Purdue in multidisciplinary engineering. So now you will be able to see them. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. And let's start this conversation with you, Shilpan. Welcome. Good morning. Let us know, first of all, as we just mentioned, the global electric vehicle sales has been growing exponentially year after year, and the industry is investing billions of dollars in technology and infrastructure to support this increase in demand. Can you please talk with us about the electric vehicles? Why are they better, and how this demand is looking around the world?
Yeah, first of all, Vanessa, thanks for having us and a very important topic for us. You know, when we think about EVs and why they're better, obviously it meets our vision, and our vision is a world of zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. And it's really about sustainability to create a better world for the future generations to come. But that alone is not enough. We had to develop a portfolio of EVs that change the customer experience in total, including drive and handling, where there's no vibration in the vehicle from the engine and transmission. It's quiet as you drive through in your vehicle. It's more connected with the technology we're bringing in on connectivity, which gives you a lot of opportunities for things like over-the-air enhancements and continued customer experiences. And it's one of those things. It's hard to describe. And right now, I drive some of our top line ICE vehicles as our company cars, and I had an opportunity to sit into our Hummer EV and spend 2 weeks in it. And you think about going into a Hummer and some of the traditional things that you think about, sound and ride and noise and vibration that comes along with it. And what I found is giving up that Hummer, when you have that much torque and power and quietness and smoothness and connectivity and technology that comes along with it, when you go back into your ICE vehicles, it feels almost like you're going back to a flip phone instead of your smartphone. It starts feeling archaic. So just the experience is so much better. I'm convinced when people get into our electric vehicles, they'll realize it. And as you mentioned, it's being demonstrated around the world when customers do get into our vehicles, and how sales continue to exponentially grow beyond most people's expectations. When we think, I was just in Colombia last week on our first 2023 zero emission car day on the road, where all emission vehicles are taken off the road. And we drove around in our Chevrolet Bolt EUV, and you see a lot of them around the roads and a lot of EVs around the world. In fact, I think year over year from 21 to 22, EV sales grew over 150% in that market. And Korea, for example, grew over 63% as we started selling our Cadillac Lyriq later this year, in addition to our Chevrolet Bolt that we have there. And Europe is the second fastest growing EV market in the world, and we're launching our new mobility business there later this year. So I'm excited about our entrance into Europe on an all electric vehicle initiative. And in fact, in China, the top selling EV in the market, and it's a large and growing market, is from GM. It's our Wuling Hongguang mini EVs. So we have an EV that's affordable for everyone, and demand continues to grow. And that's why we are investing $35 billion by 2025 in EVs and AVs.
When we think about all that challenges as well that are faced in every different part of the world, right? Because we are talking about a demand that is looking all around the world, I guess, differently, right? How, when you mentioned, for example, Europe with all that recent investment and results, how is it the work differently or adapted to every single context in every different country?
Yeah, so with our strategy under the Altium platform that I'm sure Andy will highlight a bit more on the technology behind it, but the strategy behind it is to create a platform that brings many types of vehicles that are scalable around the world. No longer do you have to develop unique engines and transmissions around the world and calibrate it and do fuel economy and certification around the world. You focus your resources on what matters to the customers, the design, what we call the top hat, where you put different sizes and shapes on these platforms, and then you personalize it through the connectivity and the digital experience that you get with the world. So the EVs will actually enable us to have more customization around the world to what matters to the customers. And I think because we can do that efficiently and use our resources to focus on the things that matter to the customers that they can see, feel, touch, that starts driving that significant growth rate.
And now we work with Lina because this is a brief introduction of each, and we, as mentioned before, keep this conversation open. There's so many other things we want to learn about it. And Lina, can you tell us more about RMI's mission? How is the organization supporting businesses, policymakers, and other sectors to fight the climate crisis, especially from the mobility perspective we're talking about?
Yeah, thank you. And Vanessa, thank you for having me today. So let me first just tell you a little bit about RMI and our mission. We are an independent nonprofit organization of more than 650 experts working to accelerate the clean energy transition to a clean, prosperous, and zero carbon future for all. And we do that by really focusing on scaling solutions around the world by decarbonizing key sectors using powerful market catalysts like finance, like big data, like capacity building. And we are focusing on 4 critical sectors, including mobility, and have projects ongoing in more than 61 countries around the world. One of the things that I think is important to note is that RMI has always believed that business-led energy transition enabled by smart policy is the best and fastest way to solve the climate crisis while creating economic opportunity and driving innovation. And so most of our work really focuses on partnering with both corporations and governments to accelerate the clean energy transition. So let me say just a couple words about our perspectives on mobility and some of the work we're doing there, since that's really the focus of this conversation. RMI does work on mobility because if you look at vehicle emissions in India, China, and the United States alone, that could consume 40% of the remaining global carbon budget required to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is a major issue that has to be addressed in order to hold the line around climate change. And beyond climate, the healthcare costs globally associated with pollution from traffic range from 70 to 110 billion per year. So this is a question of climate, but it's also a question of affordability and of equity and health. So to achieve a swift global transition to electric mobility, we think 3 things have to happen, right? We have to reduce barriers to EV supply, we have to increase public awareness and demand, and we have to establish accessible and equitable charging infrastructure. And so we RMI talk about our work around mobility as electric mobility for all, because we firmly believe that it is about actually creating the infrastructure and the awareness that enable everyone around the world to access the benefits of EVs. So just a couple, last thing I'll say is just a couple examples of some things we are doing just to help our audience understand a little bit how RMI supports corporations and governments. Over the past year, we have worked with public and private partners to publish a report called Increasing Equitable EV Access and Charging, which looks at key policy recommendations for the US to accelerate EV adoption. We also have done a lot of local analyses that have had big impacts. So just as an example, this fall in Los Angeles, we helped spur an RFP for the largest deployment of fast charging at a US airport. With GM's support, we have convened inclusive working groups to develop an EV smart framework that helps streamline zoning and permitting for charging infrastructure. And then one quick example from beyond the US, our Shunya campaign in India is engaging policymakers, consumers, over 100 industry partners to drive demand for zero emissions rides and deliveries. So over this past year, corporate partners in India have collectively delivered over 35 million shunya, or zero emission deliveries and rides. And if we scaled that broadly to all of India, we would avoid as much carbon as planting 900 million trees. So the impact is really pretty significant. And this is an example of something that I think RMI does well, but is also really critical to the climate challenge, which is to bring together direct competitors, to bring together corporations and governments to set off ambition loops that really have the ability to accelerate action and drive sort of non-linear change. So that I'll just stop there and look forward to the rest of the conversation, but hopefully at least a helpful introduction to how we look at this challenge.
We'll have plenty of time to follow up on some of these specific concepts that you mentioned. One of it was accessible charging infrastructure. And I'll go now with Andy. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. And following up this comment that Lina also shared with us, the battery is a key component of an electric vehicle. So can you explain us a bit better how a battery works, if we go from the very first beginning, how a battery works and powers an EV, and why is it the most sustainable choice, especially when talking about this climate crisis that is a huge challenge right now?
Yeah, thank you. It is a huge challenge, but it's really what makes working in the auto industry incredibly exciting right now, because we are fundamentally transforming the way vehicles are powered. And as an engineer or employee at an auto industry company now, you can come to work every day and put in your full and best efforts to do something that's helping make the planet better by addressing climate change with this transition to electric vehicles. So we're transitioning from internal combustion engines that get their power to move down the road from gas or diesel to electric vehicles that get their energy from electricity, of course. And so we're changing the platform and the paradigm of how vehicles are built and how they interact with the environment. The new platform, it's batteries plus an electric motors. That's the new platform. And what Shilpan said about the transition from flip phones to smartphones really resonated with me, because the transformation is that fundamental in the underlying technology that's inside the vehicles. For General Motors, we've developed a platform, we call it the Ultium platform, and that's what we're basing all of our new electric vehicles off of. And it's really interesting seeing that we can actually take many of our employees that have deep experience working on internal combustion engines or transmissions or the vehicles that surround them. We can actually take their skills and apply them to battery and electric vehicle engineering. I see that happen on a daily basis on my team, and it's really gratifying and satisfying to bring along all these people into the future and to take their skills and realize how much value they can add. So lithium-ion batteries, they are the miracle of science that let all of this happen, and they're central to our ability to transition to EVs. And the science of batteries is pretty straightforward, actually. We need a couple of things to make a useful battery. First, we need a positively charged particle. That's where the lithium ion comes in. Lithium's great. It's the third element on the periodic table. So it goes hydrogen, that's a gas, then helium, that's a gas, and then you get to lithium, boom. It's the first solid body at room temperature on the periodic table, and it's really lightweight because it's only got 3 protons in its nucleus. And lithium loves to give up its third electron. So when you've got 3 protons and only 2 electrons, now you've got a positively charged particle. That's called an ion. And that's the first thing that we need. We need something that's small, ubiquitous, and has a positive charge. That's lithium ion. Then the rest of what we need is we need a part of the battery that can hold on to it in the charged state and the discharged state. And we call that the anode and the cathode. So the anode is where we force the lithium ions to hang out when we charge the battery. So we put an electric current through the battery, and it attracts those positively charged lithium ions into the anode, and they have to stay there even though they don't want to, they have to stay there until we go to the next step, which is we discharge the battery. The cathode is really is the other side of the battery, and it's attractive to the lithium ions. They want to go there, and they will go there as soon as we connect a circuit across the two of them, and we let electrons flow through that circuit. And when we let that happen, these lithium ions, which are attracted to the cathode, they move over there. We pull those electrons through a circuit, and that circuit gives us power for driving EV motors or driving the rest of the vehicle's electrical systems. So the rest is just details. It's how you make all that actually happen. But basically, it's lithium ions just moving back and forth between an anode and cathode because you've pulled them there with electricity. And there's two ways that we would charge a battery in an electric vehicle. The first way is great. It's free electricity. We call it regenerative braking. So if the vehicle's already moving down the road, when you apply the brakes, we don't actually apply the friction brakes first. We hold off, we wait for that. And instead of using friction to slow the vehicle down, we take those electric motors and we turn them into generators, and we put some drag on the wheels, and that drag on the wheels creates electricity in the motor, and we charge the battery. So that's great, that's free, you get it back. Some of the energy that you use to accelerate the vehicle, you get back as you decelerate the vehicle. And then the second way we charge electric vehicles is we plug them in and we charge off the grid. And really, to wrap this all up, that's the thing that makes EVs such a great choice for the environment. Because energy used to charge an electric vehicle off the grid, it is less carbon intense than burning gasoline or diesel. And that's for almost all scenarios, almost all locations today. And it just gets greener over time as the grid gets greener. So as we deploy new renewable resources onto the grid, that just makes driving your electric vehicle even less carbon intense. And so, yeah, go ahead.
No, please finish.
Oh, sure. So the last thing I'll mention about the grid integration, and Lena probably has comments and thoughts on this, is that as we put electric vehicles on the grid, they can actually help us further decarbonize the grid in two fundamental ways that I see. One, EVs help develop the technology that's useful to the grid, like batteries that can be used for stationary energy storage on the grid. And then the second thing is EVs can help us manage the way power flows on the grid, either through managed charging, where we control when we're pulling energy off the grid and we can put that into a sweet spot, or through bidirectional capability, where electric vehicles can actually put energy back on the grid in scenarios where the grid would be useful to pull some energy off the batteries.
Well, great explanation. Thanks so much for letting us understanding this. What apparently is a very complex process, but obviously at the end for customers and for the entire system worldwide makes absolutely sense. Before going back to Lena with the following up of these comments that also Andy just said, I would go back to Shilpan. Because you lead the GM's business in many emerging markets, where a lot of the necessary regulation, environment, and infrastructure also is still not in place for any of a transition, especially with all these specific, complex process we're talking about, but also the other challenges that are facing according, as we said before, the context. So Shilpan, can you give us an overview of how these markets are progressing, and this is how is also GM supporting, how is that process done internally, and how can you see the results?
Yeah, first of all, we do believe climate change is real, and it's one of those things that you cannot be reactive to. You've got to get proactive and really drive changes each and every day to help reduce the effects that are damaging the climate. And so time is not of our friend, and we've got to make this transition as quickly as possible, which is why we are accelerating our initiatives to an all EV future. To do that, though, it does take much beyond the automobile and the product lines that we're bringing to market. It's got to drive change around the customer base and affordability, which can be jump-started through incentives for people to start converting into EVs. And then especially as the technology evolution's happening. We are continuing to drive initiatives like chemistry improvements and battery cost reductions to make it more and more affordable over time. And then the second part of that is the creation of charging infrastructures, to make it seamless as you get from point to point, while the technology evolution around increased range and quicker charging occurs. So all of it must come together, which means we have to work in collaboration, not just with our suppliers and our dealers and within the company, but also governments around the world. And in fact, last week I was in Chile, and we had the discussion around how do we drive regulations to accelerate the adaptation of EVs. How does there a strong, solid plan around infrastructure and education around what is needed to help accelerate this transition as we plan to lead in many of the countries around the world. So our role is not just to transform the company and bring the products to market, as seen by the heavy investments and resources we're putting behind it, but also to help educate and influence others to also participate in this. And that's where we also tap into the diversity of our markets across the GM international space to find these best practices and exchange them so we can scale it quickly around the world.
Sounds really interesting. You've mentioned you were recently in Colombia, but I also know you were in Egypt. I will ask you about that later because you participated in the COP27, and this is this is a key part of the agenda of what is happening and the topic we're talking today. But please let me go first to Lina. Let's go back to following up on the conversation that Andy, he mentioned something that you recently mentioned too, which is the affordability. And also one of the RMIs missions is to support efforts to increase equitable access to electrical vehicles. So Lina, can you tell us more about what companies and governments need to do to make sure everyone can afford to buy an electric vehicle in the future?
Yeah, so it's such a great question, and it's really important because I think especially in the US, we look at EVs, which are experiencing really rapid nonlinear growth, right? But we see that the early adopters of EVs in places like the US are mostly those folks who can afford Teslas. It's a minority segment. And in actuality, in the US, 80% of all cars purchased are pre-owned. 40% of Americans live in multi-unit dwellings. Our research finds that there could be significant demand for charging in low-income communities if public infrastructure or at-home charging in affordable housing existed. And beyond the US too, globally, 2- and 3-wheelers actually move more than 2 billion people per day around the world. And so what we believe really is that it is time to, if you will, invert the pyramid and focus on those market segments where the most passenger miles are and where there's no off-the-shelf solution, like for multi-unit dwellings and for low and middle income communities. And ultimately, that's the only way that we're going to see EV adoption globally beyond the early adopters, right? And so that's why we think this is such an important area to focus on around affordability, around equitable access and adoption, so that we can really expand the market for electric vehicles and bring the benefits of EVs to all. So just to your question specifically around what companies and governments can do, the first thing I'd say is that they're already doing a lot, right? So India has recently announced a really powerful loan guarantee program. The US passed a used EV tax credit as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Cities and states around the US have adopted more than 150 policies and laws just in the last year to support EVs. And then on the corporate side, I should, of course, acknowledge GM, who is the leader on EVs for the economy segment and plans to phase out internal combustion engines by 2035. It's pretty amazing, right? With a focus on how we really bring this technology to low and middle income communities. But what we need then beyond all of that that's happening are some systemic changes that actually can help realize the full potential of those government and corporate actions. So when we think about charging infrastructure in particular, and both Andy and Shilpan have mentioned the need for more of a focus on infrastructure and on charging access. Part of the reason for that is that while we see nonlinear rapid adoption of EVs, the necessary infrastructure to support those EVs, the charging infrastructure, is far more linear. And it's not being built out at a pace to keep up with the potential for EV adoption. So we've found in some of our work that more than 23,000 jurisdictional authorities around the US are struggling with their existing processes for deploying EV charging infrastructure. We know that individuals and communities without access to home charging, particularly those in multi-unit dwellings, are being excluded from the EV transition. And as I mentioned, more than 40% of Americans in major metropolitan areas live in multi-unit dwellings. That could imply more than 1 million chargers needed in the US by 2030 just for multi-unit dwellings. So without addressing that, the EV market is just simply going to struggle to scale. So what we need to do are develop those technical and economic approaches to better infrastructure deployment, building out right to charge policies, streamlining and providing best practices and guidelines around zoning, around financing for infrastructure, whole number of things. And that's where I think there's real potential for public and private organizations to come together, just as Shilpan was just saying, and drive pretty amazing breakthroughs that can allow for this scaling. And then the final thing I just want to mention is kind of outside the US. I mentioned that 2- and 3-wheelers move more than 2 billion people per year. In India, 2- and 3-wheelers represent 75% of registered vehicles. And in India, electric options, and this is increasingly the case elsewhere in the world too, but electric 2- and 3-wheelers in India are a fourth the cost from a life cycle perspective of their internal combustion engine alternatives, which would be about a $7,000 lifetime savings. And so what we need is to develop the policies to help mobilize finance, to lower the cost of EV procurement for 2- and 3-wheelers in not only India, but in the global South. And so there's pretty significant action that can happen to accelerate the overall EV market, both in the US and in other parts of the world.
Really interesting information. Some of those specific details, we as correspondents or journalists that are very much involved with information had no idea about that. So I'm sure this is going to be very useful for our audience today. And following up a little bit with all the comments the three of you are sharing, it looks like sometimes technologies and like every other, big revolution or big change in history in centuries in the past, sometimes the new technologies and even the science appears to be faster than certain mentality or process that sometimes puts some more slow in that, right? So following up on Lina's, very well explained also a process looking about the future. Andy, how the battery can make EV more affordable for people in general and accelerate the adoption of these vehicles?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I do want to circle back to something Lina said for just a second. I love that Lina's pointing out with data and research how important charging is to equitable EV deployment. And it's really interesting to see a shift in the paradigm from the early adopters to the mass market and affordable EVs. So the current paradigm that a lot of people have is that, well, everyone has a single family detached home with a garage they can charge their electric vehicle in. So you do all your charging at home, and then you only DC fast charge every now and then on a road trip. And it's really interesting to see that that's a paradigm that exists at this very specific point in time with early adopters. And that paradigm goes away and we shift to something different when you look at, like we said, multifamily home situations, where you could have many, many people that have no ability to charge at home. And so their primary means of fast charging might be DC fast charging at public infrastructure. And I think that's interesting because it takes this fast charging from being something that's perceived as a luxury today to something that's really critical and necessary for equitable deployment of EVs. So I think it's great that you highlighted that, Lena. And I talk about that in the office with my colleagues as we discuss strategies and requirements for the future. Okay, so thanks for letting me circle back to that for a second. Affordable EVs. Electric vehicle battery costs have dropped by a factor of about 10 in the last decade. So we're now at the point where electric vehicles can be profitable, and that's amazing. But the next step is to make sure that they're affordable. And General Motors is already planning an Equinox EV around $30,000, but we want to be able to go even more affordable with that because we really do take it seriously that we want to see everyone in an electric vehicle. And we do this with our flexible modular Ultium platform, and we get costs lower through two means, through technology and through scale. So with each generation of EVs, we've got research and development and good engineering that lets us implement simplified battery technology that removes costly materials and removes specialized parts in order to get costs down. So one example of that is in the battery chemistry. I talked before about the anode and the cathode. One of the materials that's particularly expensive in the cathode is cobalt. So one of the trends that you've seen and in the industry and in GM's products is to reduce the amount of cobalt in the battery. And that's great because what happens is by taking the cobalt down and increasing the nickel, we actually get battery costs down and energy goes up. So our customers are getting more range for less cost. And that's just one example. We kind of do that same sort of thing across every part of the battery design. And then on the subject of scale, we need scale at every step of the supply chain for making batteries. So that goes from raw material extraction to raw material processing, then assembling batteries and vehicles. And there's enormous economies of scale to be had that can help lower costs and improve quality as we make investments in those places. So General Motors has made investments or partnerships at many of those steps. So lithium mining, as an example, we had an announcement about that last week. Cathode active material processing, so taking that stuff you got out of the ground and turning it into useful battery material, that's processing. We have a partnership announced with a company in that space. And then when it comes to actually assembling the cells with those materials, we're already underway constructing 3 plants in the United States and have announced intentions to build a 4th. And these plants will let us build enough batteries for around 1 million electric vehicles a year, depending on the mix. So we're really pursuing that scale in all of those spaces to get costs down so we can get everyone into electric vehicles.
Very interesting. I want to remind you also that we have an audience very active and they will let us know. They will send us some questions for the last minutes. We will save 10-15 minutes to make sure, you know, we can respond some of those questions. And now, Shilpan, I'm not sure if you first, before asking you about the COP27, if you want to do the follow-up on any of the ideas that Lena and Andy shared before.
I think it's well covered on what it takes to make this accelerate this transformation. And really, it still stems from partnerships and, you know, private sector and public sectors coming together to help solve this situation around climate changes and reducing the amount of emissions in the environment. So what they did was frame up well of what's needed, and now we need to come together and find the solutions behind it.
So one of the most important meeting around the world about all this topic is COP27 in Egypt, as I mentioned before. And General Motors was an active participant. You were there. representing the company. Can you tell us more about your experience on the ground from your perspective? In your view, are the public and the private sector marketing progress on the necessary, are these sectors making progress on the necessary partnership that need to be forged to combat the climate change, which is actually in the agenda of every single institution, company, public, private sector around the world?
Yeah, first of all, it was great to see the progression into COP27, where no longer is it about convincing people about climate change and the effects it can have to the environment. In fact, many of the discussions you go into share the impacts countries around the world have already had around climate changes and the frequencies of issues occurring. So, we're past the stage of convincing and now into how do we solve it, which is a great stage to be in, because when there's recognition that there's a major issue at hand that we have to solve, and a recognition where the private sectors and public sectors can come together to solve it, that's when the magic happens. That's when, we will accelerate all the solutions around what it takes to address this issue, because it helps everyone around the world, and not just all of us that are here today, but it's for our generations to come, which is why COP27 was such an important event for GM story, as we advocate the importance of these partnerships between private sectors and government, and all the ideas that we have already and want to learn other ideas that are out there on solutions that can help support an equitable transition to an all-electric future around the world. A couple of things we were able to do, to support this partnership and scalability. We announced GM is joining the First Movers Coalition, which comprises of several companies that are looking to use all of our purchasing power collectively in the carbon intensive sectors to enable the creation of low carbon technology. And it's a great example of recognizing that these partnerships are important, and together we can combat climate change. We also informed customers and the media that Cadillac is returning to Egypt as an all-electric brand, and we demonstrated our Cadillac Lyric, which is the start of this return of Cadillac to Egypt. But it wasn't just about that. That was the announcement. We had this wonderful product of Cadillac Lyric, but we wanted to demonstrate that we will create an affordable EV for everyone. And to do that, it was about experience and what it means to be in these products. As I mentioned, it's hard to describe in words. It's easier when you just get into a product and see what it means. And so we became the exclusive mobility principal partner, and we provided a fleet of 150 EVs, including the Chevrolet Spark EVs, which are some of the most affordable EVs in the world in the A-car segment, our Bolt EUVs, and our Cadillac Lyrics on the roads of Sharm el-Sheikh to demonstrate the breadth of our GM portfolio. It was great when you can redefine areas like the A-car segment being all electric, and some of the factors that give a better customer experience where you don't have this engine in front and a transmission in back that has to squeeze everyone together. You could actually move the IP in the front passengers forward and the rear passengers rearward, and you still get cargo space to store things as you have a lot of space in the front and the back. So it helped open the minds around what it means, how this transformation will make better products and better experiences for everyone while contributing to the solution around climate change. So great discussions at COP27, many insights that we learned, and hopefully some of the people took away from around driving and accelerating to this all electric future. And, we're looking forward to continue those discussions.
And how does it help being in touch with so many different people from other industries? How does it help in the process itself, in this case for General Motors, to improve even more and to get a better product when you see what other people are doing with probably sometimes a very different product, but you at least share common goals sometimes? So how did it help also being in this meeting with people from all around the world?
I think a couple of areas. One is just sharing lessons learned. And if you think about some of the manufacturing industries and different parts of the world, demonstrating the technology evolution that's happening and recognizing the investments that are being made. I mentioned we're committed to $35 billion, and a big part of it is driving the technology forward. And the more and more we can communicate that and its applicability to help others solve their issues, helps accelerate a better world in the future. And the second part is sharing lessons learned that we're facing or we're seeing. We have a great opportunity across many parts of the world to hear what governments are doing and what initiatives are already going in place and how it's receptive and assisting with the transformation. And so we can be efficient and not relearn the effective solutions. We help connect that to governments around the world and industries around the world, and hopefully make all of us efficient in our capital transitions to this all-electric future.
That was part of a question we just received. We have another one for Lina, but we wanted to ask her first, following also Shilpan's comments. Here, Lina, actually, RMI, where you work, has recently announced a partnership. As Shilpan was talking about other partnerships that General Motors announced recently. One of them is with your company. Both companies want to develop standards and policies to virtual power plants. How can you tell us more about these virtual power plants, and how is it helping, or how can it help in the future reducing stress on the energy grid? We have another question for you very briefly now, but if you can let us know more about this partnership before.
Sure, I'll just speak to it briefly because it really harkens back to something Andy said in some of his earlier comments about how the rise of electric vehicles really are representing, for the first time, a situation where the transportation sector and the electricity sector are fundamentally linked together, right, and interactive. And that is an amazing opportunity, right, but also a challenge to be solved. And so from our perspective, what we call virtual power plants, which are the aggregation of many distributed energy resources like electric vehicles, like solar panels and batteries, like demand response, where you choose to lower your demand on the grid. These things together represent virtual power plants. And we believe that virtual power plants are the most important and most overlooked domestic energy resource today. So just as an example, last summer, when California had such record-breaking grid-straining heat waves, the state actually had to send a text message to all residents asking for emergency and voluntary electricity conservation, which worked, right? Energy demand dropped, blackouts were avoided. So that's an amazing demonstration of how the demand side, how virtual power plants made up of resources in all of our homes can be such an incredible resource. But it also points to a pretty concerning paradox, which is that while a handful of electric utilities and power plant owners are paid millions to keep the grid operating, millions of homeowners were paid nothing in that case to really stabilize the grid when it mattered. And so the partnership that we are helping to convene with GM and others, called VP3, the Virtual Power Plant Partnership, is really working to break down a lot of the policy and regulatory and market-based challenges so that we can catalyze greater adoption of virtual power plants for the benefit of society, and to be able to leverage those resources in all our homes, including electric vehicles, right, to make money, to increase the overall affordability of our resources. So we've done some work recently showing that by 2030, just using the top 20% of an electric vehicle's battery charge could be worth up to $4,500 per vehicle. And so there's real value to be had, which then makes the purchase and operations of an electric vehicle much more affordable for people. So a lot of these sort of systemic connections are where we think there are important breakthroughs to be had, and what we're really excited to work on both with GM and with our other partners.
Okay, so if you're ready now, I will read this question we got from George, our member. He could have access to the research that you released at COP27 with the IKEA Foundation on global philanthropy priorities for climate change. And he's asking about the priority around supporting the market for electrical 2-3 wheels in emerging economies. So his question is, what extent do you think that bundled membership service for vehicles access and charging can support the transition in developing markets?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, George. And what I would just say to that, and possibly Andy and Shilpan have perspectives on this one as well, is so as I said, 2- and 3-wheelers are, I don't know, to some extent where it's at, right? In India and the global south. These are the vehicles that move most of the people and most of the goods, and therefore an incredible intervention point and leverage point, right? There are lots of things that need to happen to support the overall transition to EV 2- and 3-wheelers. I mentioned some of them, including just public awareness. So our Shunya campaign is about actually sort of labeling electric vehicles, publicizing that along with the Indian government in a way that actually significantly drives demand for more electric vehicle deliveries. So there's that part of it. But what you're speaking to, George, is another part of it, which is how do we actually develop innovative business models that can better enable ownership of and use of 2- and 3-wheeler EVs. So I absolutely think that shared membership models is a viable option. The other one that kind of we think about is with 2- and 3-wheelers in particular, there's a real opportunity to sort of drive into a garage, take out your used battery, replace it with a fully charged battery, and drive off. So in this case, you don't have to wait to charge your battery at all, right? You can just do a battery swap. And that's something that's much easier, although Andy can tell us, not impossible, but much easier with 2- and 3-wheelers than with passenger vehicles. And so I think that one of the main things that needs to happen is innovation around what that suite of business models can be that overcome some of these like sticky barriers that make people hesitant to move towards EVs.
Andy or Shilpan, do you want?
Well, first I'll say Lena's absolutely correct that battery swapping of a smaller battery for a 2- or 3-wheel application makes way more sense than it does for large vehicles. I actually used to have a vehicle where the 3rd row seat was removable, and it was embarrassing taking it in and out of the vehicle because it was so heavy and I was barely capable of getting it in and out myself. So if you think about battery swapping for passenger cars, the batteries are frankly, they're too heavy. It's about, you could think about it this way, about 100 pounds of battery you'd have to lift in and out to go about 30 miles of range. And that's just not going to make anyone happy. But in the case of a 2- or 3-wheeler, the weight of the pack you'd have to remove and install compared to the range you would get. It's a much better value proposition for the customer.
And Andy, now that you mentioned range anxiety is a very common that people comes, in its minds when they think about switching to an EV. So how do you face that challenge, and how is it implemented strategically, let's say, in General Motors?
Yeah, we're at a point now where battery technology is enabling long-range vehicles of around 300 to 400 miles of range if you build a new electric vehicle platform from the ground up. And so that's what we've done with the Ultium platform. We've been focusing on, from day one, our focus was how can we get customers more range at lower cost. Now, I think a lot of customers don't understand that EVs really can go the distance yet. And we're addressing that through marketing and word of mouth. And like Shilpan was saying, just direct exposure, getting people into these vehicles so they can see that long range electric vehicle travel. That's a today thing. It's not a tomorrow thing. So on a road trip today, you can go 300 to 400 miles depending on the vehicle, and you can recharge at one of these DC fast charge stations we've talked about. Our new Ultium-based EVs, they can add around 75 to 100 miles of range in as little as 10 minutes of charging, depending on the capability of the charger. So that's, you know, a great way to have a quick break, go grab a cup of coffee, come back, and get back on the road. Another thing that we're trying to recognize, though, is that not every customer needs or wants 300 or 400 miles of range. So we're trying to meet customers where they're at for their driving needs and their budget. And that's one of the reasons we like the scalability and modularity of our platform, is that we can add and subtract battery from the vehicle. When the customer orders the vehicle, they can pick the size of the battery and the range that they want. Personally, actually, behind this wall of cabinets behind me is my garage. I have a Bolt EUV charging there right now, and that goes only 247 miles, which is great for me because I don't need to go more than about 40 miles in a day. So some customers will pick one type of vehicle, others will pick another. The last thing I would circle back to, though, I actually think it'll become obvious in the next couple of years. I think we're transitioning from a paradigm of range anxiety today to what I would call charging anxiety in the future. Because when you get into your electric vehicle, first of all, they're all pretty long range to begin with. And they have really good predictions of how far they're going to go. So I don't worry about how far I can go on my electric journeys anymore. What people worry about is, what's my charging experience going to be like when I get to my destination or when I get along the way? Will the charger work? Will someone already be using it? Will it be blocked by a gas or diesel vehicle? And can it charge as fast as my vehicle is capable of accepting a charge? So in order to address what this thing that I think we're all going to become more aware of, I call charging anxiety, GM's making investments in the charging ecosystem with companies like Pilot Flying J and EVgo to really build out a really good charging network with high quality chargers and uptime agreements to make sure that these things are available when customers get there.
Getting that information is essential, because people who didn't know that they can have a personalized service, maybe that can work for them as well. Let's do a last round with a question from all our foreign correspondents, but through Thomas Barat. It's going to be the same questions for you all, because I think it's just looking into the future. Let's start again with you, Shilpan, unless you also want to add, a closing remarks idea about what you just hear from Andy and Lena as well. So let me ask you this question, and then I will give you each of you time to respond for this very last minute of our conversation. What is your fear and what is your hope for electrical vehicle industry for the future? So let's start with you, Shilpan.
Yeah, I think connecting even back to the conversations that Lena and Andy mentioned, the hope and the recognition is the evolution of technology is coming faster than anyone expected. And things that we didn't know how to solve just 1 year ago are now on a path to not just solve, but beyond the expectations we have. My fear is not enough people jump on board with all the environmental things that we need as far as bringing incentives and infrastructure, and recognizing this evolution is critical to the health of the earth, as well as critical to enable these solutions. So when I think about things that even we weren't part of in the past, we talked about energy and rethinking the grid and how power is consumed and distributed. We launched in October of 2022 a business called GM Energy, which is about the holistic ecosystem of connected energy management in products and services, including home, commercial, charging, et cetera. And then, to Lena's point of where this is applicable, some of these industries do not have at this time probably the depth of capital and R&D needed to find electrification into two-wheelers and three-wheelers around the world. And to Andy's point, the technology that we've put in place around the cells to the modules to the packs and the scalability behind it actually has applications to many of these industries. We've already announced partnerships in aerospace and locomotive and the marine industry to scale this technology even further. And that technology as it comes aboard will be applicable in just about all types of mobility around the world. So very exciting times ahead. We've just got to help educate and communicate and then bring together to help support this transformation.
Thank you, Shilpan. Lina, you want to be the next one?
Sure, I'll be really brief. I know we're just about out of time, but I'll say that my hope is that this transition to electric vehicles actually can drive the solution to climate change, right? And it can do so in a way that actually provides better equitable access to everyone in the world, right? So that's the opportunity that we have. It's pretty straightforward to achieve in some ways, right? My fear on the other side, I really liked what Andy said about charging anxiety. And I think that's as we look at this, I think all the solutions exist to enabling this transition to electric vehicles. And the trick of it is in actually helping people believe and understand that, right? And in bringing together corporations who are doing so much creative development and innovation, and governments to actually put the solutions in place that really are at the boundary between public infrastructure and private investment. And I think that's doable, but hard, and we have to get on it in order to make it happen fast.
Andy.
Yeah, first of all, I'm pretty optimistic about our ability to transition to an electric vehicle future. But I'd say we talked a lot about in-use emissions, right? So charging the vehicle off the grid means that you have the ability to charge with low carbon intensity now, and it gets better over time. What we didn't talk a lot about was the greenhouse gas emissions to manufacture or recycle that electric vehicle. So my biggest fear, and also sustainability issues around material extraction. So my biggest fear would be that globally, there's a lot of private and public entities that need to make sure that we have equitable, sustainable, low emissions extraction and manufacturing of electric vehicles and recycling of electric vehicles and batteries. Now, I worry that might not happen, but I'm actually quite hopeful that there is awareness of those issues today, and that awareness is driving action. And in the case of, for example, battery recycling, there's incentives in place to recycle batteries and to build profitable businesses there. So I see all of those things that am worried about being addressed through the efforts of a great deal of people. I just hope that continues and gets scaled.
Well, that's what we all hope as well, and a very positive message to end this conversation for now. Not before appreciating your time and your participation. Very special thanks to Shilpan, Lina, and Andy for joining us today, as well as our audience connected today. We had a lot of people, behind the cameras, and it was very instructive and fruitful conversation as part of our educational program of the Foreign Press Correspondents Association. And we will keep this conversation open, because we will also post all content in all of our platforms. And I want to give a special thanks as well to Thanos Dimadis and Ariadne Pereira for bringing this event together and for making it possible. So thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. It was great having you with us in this educational program, and hope to see you soon. Thank you very much, and have a great week.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.